Okay, it's Friday. We are on the tertiary backup camera system here for reasons that I have not yet uncovered. We were going through the troubleshooting. We were going through troubleshooting checklists A, B, C, and D, and couldn't figure it out. So that's why I look like this without the magic of my very forgiving primary camera lens.
God, I love that.
So yeah, man, this poor camera, just this one can't handle the lighting or anything like that. It's terrible. But anyways, it's Friday.
You should have stayed at Holiday Inn Express last night, Jacob. That was
I still have problems. I still have nightmares about that live stream. Oh my god. But anyways, it's Friday. Daniel, how are you?
I'm fantastic. How are you, Jacob?
Pretty good, despite the terrible lighting. I feel pretty good. It is it's not CS2 Eve, but it's CS2 pre-weekend Eve. CS2's next week. Yeah, CS2's next week, everybody. So in-person tickets are sold out. There's going to be like 270-ish people there in person, which is a lot of people. If you've ever tried to coordinate coffee breaks and lunch for 270 people coming in and out of one room, it's a lot of people. So if you didn't get an in-person ticket, or if you don't want to deal with 270 people trying to get coffee at the same time, virtual registration is still available. You have access to all the same sessions. You have access to all the breakout sessions in the afternoon. You have access to chat. We pull questions for Q&A out of the virtual queue, just like we do in person as well. And you can use the discount code scrolling across the bottom down there for Hotline Reston for 15% off of the registration up until the conference kicks off, I believe. So yeah, still time to do that, and still plenty of space for virtual registrations.
Unlimited, some might say.
Unlimited. Yeah, if we do hit the limit, that'd be amazing. I don't actually know what the upper limit is. But anyways, let's talk about our thoughts of the week. Daniel, we've talked about this before. CMMC takes the blame for so many things that have been uncovered by CMMC that are not CMMC's responsibility.
No, they are not. So I had two conversations this week. The first conversation was with a weapons manufacturer, and they sell commercial products and do work for the DoD, as you can imagine. And we were talking about CUI and data flow. And they're like, yeah, we think we can do an enclave. I said, oh, fantastic. I said, what are you doing for your commercial ITAR? They're like, well, what do you mean? I was like, you know, the guns that you sell overseas that fall into the ITAR classification. And they were like, I think we're having our trade compliance lawyer on the phone. I said, okay. So trade compliance jumps in.
This is not a startup. This is not a new company.
No, this is a company of thousands of people. And so we're having the conversation with the trade compliance lawyer, lovely gentleman. And I pull up a slide. Go figure. For those that know me, I'm a PowerPoint guy. And I pull up this particular slide. Let's see here. The problem with having so many slides is it's hard to find the one that you need when you need it.
And just to add some context here, these people are calling you because they want to take care of CMMC, and they are now discovering issues that are massive only because they picked up the phone to deal with CMMC.
That's exactly right. And so they have a large commercial cloud, M365 commercial. And so basically I had to address the problem that M365 commercial does not have the level of protections you need for ITAR. If it's commercial ITAR, if you remove the CMMC requirements of FedRAMP and all that stuff, and you're just looking at ITAR requirements, the two major outstanding things are U.S. persons and U.S. sovereign data centers, which commercial will not guarantee you either of those things. And there's something called a deemed export, right? So when someone has the ability to access, or you are enabling someone to access this information without a license, that's a non-US person, we have an issue, right? And so within about 15 seconds of getting their trade compliance lawyer on the phone, showing him this slide, he's like, yeah, we've got a problem. We've got to solve this larger issue of not only CMMC, so CUI data flow in the organization. Now we have to assess for technical data packages that are being flown through our commercial tenant in an unencrypted format as well, and which is a lot more of their business than the DoD business. And so there's some carve outs or exemptions for things like bring your own key and things like that. That's kind of more technical in nature that could be enforced, but very few people actually do that type of implementation of M365. And so anyways, so that was the first conversation I had with the realization that commercial ITAR, you also have to do things for, and that Microsoft Commercial is not suited to fix that problem. And then the next call I had, which was yesterday, and Jacob, I don't know if you were on this one or not. I had a quote out to an organization at the end of last year. They ended up going with a different provider. And they're a manufacturer, about 150 people. And they called me back, or they sent me an email Wednesday night and said, it's urgent. We need to talk to you. I said, okay, I'm happy to talk to you. So I scheduled a meeting the next day, and we're sitting in the call, and they're like, we were using an MSP that was leveraging Prevail. Turns out the MSP didn't actually know about ITAR, which is a red flag, right? They had U.S. person support or U.S. citizen support. So they had some of the pieces figured out. So this was not a complete issue. However, they were just uninformed about the process of things. So when I was talking about having to have export control licenses at some point, we talked about the U.S. persons, and then we talked about the data center piece. And the MSP itself was compliant from a staffing perspective at their level. However, as we've talked about countless times on this show, MSPs use a lot of third-party tools. And the third-party tools will at times have administrative access to parts of the environment that would allow them to access unencrypted technical data that happens to be export control.
Which is exactly, yep.
And so they ended up calling back. And so we're working through that problem right now. And it's really interesting because they're having to, again, pivot after they just made this large investment in this other MSP 6 months ago, because it was the second tier of support that had to be validated that the MSP didn't think about. So when you're vetting people, so there's two things. Number one, commercial ITAR still has requirements that Microsoft Commercial can't meet. So just be aware of that. And make sure that if you're using external partners, MSPs, MSSPs, that they either A, don't have administrative access to access this data in an unencrypted format, or they're all US persons or US citizens, depending on your export control, all the way up the chain, right? So anyways, I say all this to say, ITAR has its own problems and things you have to resolve outside of CMMC. But to your point, Jacob, the only reason these people are finding these problems is because of CMMC. This weapons manufacturer that I talked to would have just kept chugging along.
Yep.
And I told them and the trade compliance lawyer, I said, just so you're aware, when I say things like this in a setting where there's representation, especially at a senior level of an organization, there's some kind of fall into like you're liable for doing something about it now, right?
Yep. Yeah.
I was like, you can't just, ignore it now that you're informed, even though by signing the contracts, you technically attested to being informed of this. But anyways, just kind of interesting out there. Don't neglect ITAR outside of CMMC, but CMMC seems to be the driving force to find all of these ITAR issues, which, by the way, carry heavier fines and prison time. So not to be a fear, uncertainty, and doubt guy, but I showed him this slide, which Ryan Bonner refers to as the who has to wear orange or who has to write the check slide. And this will sober up the conversation very quickly. So anyways, it's crazy.
People are always like, oh, it's FUD. You're talking about FUD. I mean, you can bring the story up. Raytheon just settled with the DOJ for $8.5 million for cybersecurity false claims for the exact same things that everybody's talking about. I mean, we talk about how CMMC has caused people to find out about ITAR noncompliance.
Yep.
People are like, oh, why is CMMC so worried about FedRAMP? I'm like, that's a DFARS 7012 requirement.
Yes.
These are requirements that have been around since 2016. ITAR export control requirements even longer than that. Somebody in chat was saying, oh, wait, not that one. Somebody in chat was saying, would this make them liable under False Claims Act if they claim to be ITAR? Yeah, 100%. If the right people knew that this was happening, then they're going to get smacked for millions of dollars, which is why their lawyer went into panic mode when we literally just showed a slide that said, have you read this part, which I'm always amused whenever there's companies large enough to have internal legal teams. And then they're like, oh, wow, yeah, that's a problem. I'm like, shouldn't you be telling us that that's a problem? Isn't that what they pay you for? We're just the managed service provider here.
And that's the interesting thing. And listen, I talk to a lot of fantastic companies that once made aware are doing the right thing. And so this is not to throw any of those organizations under the bus, but there's so much unawareness of what people are signing up for contractually when they do this kind of stuff. It just, no one read the fine print. Yeah. They said, oh my gosh, we have a multi-million-dollar contract that's going to save our business or allow our business to grow or allow acquisitions, or the excitement gets ahead of them. And they don't realize, oh no, Jacob, I got to tell you another story real quick, and then I'll let you get to your thing.
No.
Had another call this week where an MSP did a gap assessment for a company and gave them 109 out of 110 score.
Ooh.
I just had this phone call, by the way.
Not impossible, but not very likely.
And so I get a phone call from that organization saying, hey, we low-key just figured out that wasn't right. And we want to do the right thing. We're expecting an RFP here in the next couple of months. We're going to put together a proposal. We're going to submit it, but we want to do it under the guise that we're actually representing ourselves correctly, which, by the way, hats off to them, right? Yeah. Instead of lying and keeping the 109, kind of like what Morse did, quite honestly, right? Morse kept the score that they knew was not accurate in
Correct.
Spurs. They want to right size it prior to submitting a large proposal for a DoD contract. And so, it's just like one of those things where you start peeling back the hood and people are trying to do the right thing, but have been led down the wrong path. Or in some of the instances with ITAR we talked about, didn't read the fine print of what all's in scope and what the penalties could be if they did the wrong thing.
I'll tell you what, I got a little story that is off the books here. We don't have a banner for it or anything like that, but I had a call from a friend of mine this week, and they were working at a small defense startup.
Okay.
And won't say what they do or where they were or anything like that. They're a small defense startup. They had maybe one or two IT security folks getting their stuff set up. The IT security people were aware of what's going on, and they were implementing their controls to 171, just like you're supposed to. So when they first came on and they first stood up maybe 6-ish months ago, they put in their score as like negative 190 or whatever, because they didn't have anything implemented. They had just started, and that was their score. And so they're working on implementing, doing their thing. Same kind of battles, right? Like, where is this in the priority? Oh, we got to wait till next month, yada, yada, yada. Nothing that's unfamiliar to people. And the contract officer for the work that they were, they had this relationship with for the DoD, called them up and said, hey, your SPRS score is too low. We can't tell you what it needs to be, but we can tell you that we can't work with you if it's that low. And so
this is the first time I've ever heard of this happening, by the way.
And so they said, no problem. We've been implementing stuff, so we'll update our score. And I think they put in a score of like 10 or something like that, which in 6 months, going from like negative 200 to 10 is a ton of implementation. I mean, that's a massive, increase in what's going on. Obviously, they wish that they had a better score because, whatever, but that them's the breaks. And they didn't get the contract, and they fired everybody. Because the DoD said not good enough. So this is not a CMMC thing. This is I know the person that this happened to. I've known them since I was in the Navy. So you're talking 15, 20 years at this point. Whoa. And they went up in smoke because the DoD was like, you got to have the requirements or we can't give you the data, period. And they said, well, we've made a bunch of progress. And they were like, you don't have it implemented, next. And that's not going to be on the news. That's not a CMMC thing or anything. That's DFARS 7019, DFARS 7020, and getting reached out to by the contracting officer saying, hey, this needs to be improved. And, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, we'd really like to work with you. And they were like, we can't wait. We got to go with somebody else. Try again next time. And then that was it.
That is crazy.
So
SPRS brought down a whole company.
Yeah, but I mean, I don't remember. I don't know how big it wasn't. A very big company. I don't know how many folks they had, but yeah, I mean, these are the kinds of stories that don't get out. They don't have stories about them, and we've seen a big uptick recently in people calling about getting implementation started. Even though we're still waiting for CMMC to show up in contracts. My theory is it's because stuff like this is happening on the back end.
Well, Blake just put a comment in here. Wow, I've never heard of a minimum score. We're a prime until subs to accurate score. No minimum score required. More important that it's accurate. Blake, I'm in the same way. This is the first time I've heard of the DoD, especially withholding what the score needs to be. Probably because contractually
Now,
there is no.
who knows? I mean, there could
score.
be other details that are not
Sure.
that I don't know of. It could be that they had the people they wanted to work with, and this was a convenient way to get rid of competitors. And that happens with all kinds of stuff, not just cybersecurity scores. If there's a reason that they can cut people out, you might have thought they were, you were super friendly, but they wanted to go with this or whatever. I don't know if that's true, but you just won't know. There's no way for you to know. The only way to insulate yourself is to do the implementation and take it out of the set of variables that could be used to keep you from getting the work. Because when you end up in this situation, like they're small, they're cool, they're high speed, they have a relationship with the contracting officer, and then it comes down to we need to negotiate on an exception for the requirements. The DoD can go heads I win, tails you lose. We don't want to do it, and so you don't really have a leg to stand on at that point. So there's all kinds of these stories that are popping out at this point. So, I mean, you have to just take it with a grain of salt because it's an anecdote, but it's from somebody that I know really well. And yeah, there's one more quick story, then we'll get to chat. One more interesting story here. I guess it's sort of related to the thought of the week here. If anybody, you probably pull that one up there, Daniel. If anybody is unaware, Katie Arrington is back as the DoD CIO, the original face of the CMMC program. And it's just like 2019 and 2020 again, where she is gloves off, telling it like it is. This is the thing that I tell people about Katie. When Katie first came out, she ruffled a lot of feathers, right? A lot of people bristled at the language and her tone and the types of things that she said, including me at the time, because I was like, this lady is out of her mind. She hates small businesses. This is terrible. And the light bulb moment went off for me when I discovered the Federal Register and the fact that when you find old DoD cyber rules, they include the department's policy rationale for hundreds and hundreds of pages. And when you go back and you read all of the policy rationale prior to Katie working for the DoD, they say the same thing, just much quieter, right? They say things like, if you can't meet the requirements, then you don't get the work. The requirements don't scale down for small businesses. You've already had these requirements. All these talking points that people associate with Katie directly are the department's position that have been that way since before Katie. They were the same when she was there the first time. They were the same after she left. And they're the same now that she's back. The only difference is she's the only one that says it like this, right?
As bluntly as something like on the screen here.
Yeah. Now, Brigadier General Murphy, for those of you who remember back in the day, was even more pointed circa 2018, 2019 about what was going on. And Katie's kind of a softer version of the way that the 4-stars were talking about it, who worked directly for SecDef Mattis back in the day. So this is not an anomaly, but in case, a lot of people got lulled into thinking that the department had changed its position, it has not changed. And Katie's back to tell you the way it is. Tell you another quick off the book story here. I have heard rumors. We get this question all the time. Is CMMC expanding across different agencies and things like that? I have heard rumors that there are memos circulating, that there is guidance circulating, that entire agencies affiliated or related to DoD in certain ways, if you catch my drift, who use a lot of contractors, are just across the board policy say you need CMMC if you're going to deal with our data. Like, they're not even going to try and do like a DoD memo where they say, oh, it's this category of CUI or whatever. They're just like, if you work with our data, like, it's just CMMC. We're not even going to, because of the type of work that they do. They're like, we don't have time to, chop and minimize and do all that stuff. Like, you either meet these requirements or you just don't get the work. And that's exactly what Katie is saying. And so this is not a single point. There's a lot of this happening across the department. Katie's just the only one that says it out loud. So she ruffles a lot of feathers, but it's what everybody's thinking when they're not on stage at the department.
Well, just to quote what's on the screen, the business of defense is not something we should take lightly, Arrington said. If it's too hard, get out of the business. We've been having these conversations with primes fairly frequently over the past 2 or 3 weeks as we're kind of getting into launching our supply chain program to help them educate their network. But the question keeps getting brought up. Don't they know that this is going to cripple the supply chain for the DoD? And I come back and say, yeah, they do. It's like they actually have some awareness that people are going to exit the defense space, but they would rather have fewer suppliers that are protecting the data than more suppliers that are not.
Right. That's the trade-off.
It's as simple as that. And yeah, a statement like that just tends to validate those types of, statements, quite honestly.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's like Joseph said, right? So a lot of people aren't big fans, that she goes so hard in the paint. But honestly, as soon as when Katie left, right? I mean, you were there, Daniel. I wasn't at Summit 7 yet, but when Katie came on the stage and got in people's faces, all of a sudden people started taking their requirements seriously, right? All of a sudden it just exploded where people were like, we have to do this. When Katie left, what did everybody do? They took their foot off the gas,
into a lull,
right?
Nobody was driving them.
And so even though we were trying to amplify DoD's statements being like, hey, just so you know, just because they're talking softly doesn't mean that they're changing their position. Don't lose sight of what's happening here. And that's when it turned into, oh, you're just selling us things and blah, blah. You don't work for the department. Well, then the DoD got even more quiet because during the 32 CFR rulemaking, they're not allowed to say anything at all. Mm-hmm. And everybody goes, well, I haven't heard anything in months. So it's definitely dead. And now Katie's back and everybody's like, oh God, we got to do stuff. So, I mean, the only lesson that you have here is like the only time that people are really taking it seriously is when someone gets in their faces. So, when they ask nicely, it just doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen. So
enter the stick, right? Tried the carrot, tried to just throw you the claws. Katie even says in that article that we posted, right? It's like, hey, if you guys just would have done NIST, guess what? We wouldn't be here today.
Yeah. I mean, people hate that talking point, but it's still true. They had that thing in another article of hers where when the 2020 rule came out, they had the CMMC provision, and then they also had the SPRS scoring provision. And in that SPRS scoring, they say when your POAM is supposed to be done. And when they went through all the data, they were like, people were putting in like 2999, 21, the year 2100. Like, we'll finish our, they were like, oh, when will you finish your POAM? There was no requirement for like, you must finish by this date. So people were putting in like the year 3000, we'll finish it in 100 years. And so like she says in the article, she's like, you think the department doesn't see that? Like, you think the department doesn't notice that every time they show up to somebody's perfect SPRS score self-attestation, it's 100 points overstated? Like, it's been like that for years. Of course, they're still going to make you go through an assessment at this point. It's just, Anyways, let's get to some questions, huh?
Yeah. Listen, we just spent the first half hour talking about crazy stuff. So let's figure out what the people need here.
So, basic question, is a managed service provider a requirement for CMMC? Must I use a managed service provider?
No. But if you are under, I would probably say 200, 300, 400 people, you probably are going to need to lean in to some sort of external service provider from a wide variety of reasons. Maybe it's IT support. Maybe you have that covered. Maybe it's security operations, right? Or maybe you have that covered, right? But maybe you need some outsourced compliance support, which is kind of the bigger need right now that we're seeing in the ecosystem, right? Maybe you can't afford a dedicated CCA on staff, CMMC certified assessor, or hiring or putting somebody through CCP training, CMMC certified professionals. So long story short,
maybe you put your IT team through CCA training and they left to get paid more.
So it's funny you say that. Not the second part, luckily, but I was talking to a large construction company that got certified a year and a half ago through joint surveillance. And they just got their IT team, all their IT team through CCP training. They're all going to go take the test. I was
Nice.
like, that's the kind of investment. And this is a construction company,
Yeah.
right? This isn't all they do, but they see the investment they need to make in their staff to do it. So, maybe you don't have the staff. Maybe the people that were certified left for a 6-figure job somewhere else. Ryan jokes saying, if you've got somebody that knows CMMC, make sure to look behind you because their chair's probably spinning because they've just taken a crazy job at a Raytheon or a Boeing or Lockheed. Or
well, I'll tell you exactly what we were talking earlier about my friend who was at the startup and they didn't get the contract and now they're looking for more work. And he was like, I'll tell you exactly how I'm going to frame it. It'd be like, I took this company from -200 to 15 in 6 months.
Yep.
And so he's like, I have the percentage increase. I've got all the stuff that I implemented, all that stuff. And it's like, you just stand on the corner and spin a sign that says, I can get you in 6 months. I can get you this level of implementation. People will be like, can you start in 5 minutes? So he's not worried at all at that point because he's got the experience implementing it, which is
and we saw this, and this is all public info, like Jacob Hill, right?
Yeah.
He was a Doge, Doge got him basically. But he has a crazy, incredible track record of getting small businesses up to compliance. He was having to beat people away with offers to get hired somewhere else. So it definitely exists out there.
Absolutely. And so, just I guess to clarify, if anybody's still curious about this, so using a managed service provider doesn't mean that you have no internal IT people. We work with tons of companies where they've got 1 or 2 or this or that, and they augment the work with our services. So it can be entirely taking the place if you don't have any internal resources. But just because you have some internal resources also doesn't mean that it wouldn't be helpful for what you have going on.
Well, can I put one more piece of color on that, Jacob?
Oh, sure.
And I'm actually going to paste a slide in here from the town hall that's been circulating a little bit. You know what I'm talking about? Oh boy,
what a slide that was.
So, again, kind of on the current events side of the house, let's pivot this over here.
We had a great question about this actually. Now that you're pulling this up, I actually have it queued, so this is perfect. How serendipitous here. So the question that came in was, does managed services mean you do all of the work for us? Which is a very convenient question now that you want to talk about this slide. This is from the AB Town Hall this month, just earlier this week.
I think it was earlier this week, like Tuesday maybe. Yeah, so the short answer is no. Anybody promising that is trying to grab your money and trying to leave you in the lurch, quite honestly. So they cannot own CMMC, right? Now, at Summit 7, we say that we can support you through all of the controls and assessment objectives, but I'll give you a good example. How can an MSP own your authorization process for users? They can provision users when you tell them to. Are they running background checks? Are they validating that user is who they say they are before they are allowed into this environment? And they even use that example here for the third bullet. It's like, there's just certain things that would be impossible for an MSP to actually do on your behalf.
Yeah.
And so just be hyper aware. This was the kind of the slide that was around on the Cyber AV Town Hall. These are the things to look out for. They can't own your SSP from the sense of the whole thing. They can't give you their SSP with 100% compliance because, again, it's impossible. They're just things they can't do.
Well, they're also not the contractor or the subcontractor. You are,
they're not.
Right? You are. Now, to be fair, right, the way that we tell people to look at this is the first step is to ask for a shared responsibility matrix mapped to the criteria in 800-171 alpha rather than just 800-171 because the 320 criteria in 171 alpha are the questions that get asked during the assessment. That's actually what they're referencing here in the examples with those brackets that have the letters in them. Those are actually some of the criteria in 171A that you wouldn't see if you're only looking in 800-171. That's the first step, is do they have one mapped to 171A? What you should see at that point is the criteria that the MSP covers and the criteria that you're responsible for, and probably some verbiage in there that says, for these things that you're responsible for, we're still helping you with them, but we can't own them for you. We don't determine who your authorized users are. When you tell us who your authorized users are, of course, then we're going to run access controls, configurations, account permissions, all that stuff based on who those authorized users are. But we don't get to just wake up one day and go, oh, Bob's authorized, Susan's not authorized, and then change our minds the next day or whatever. We don't determine who gets terminated or why. Like, do we have certain things that need to happen once someone gets terminated in order to meet requirements? Absolutely. So sometimes what you'll see is you'll see people say, well, Summit 7's shared responsibility matrix says that they cover 80%, 88% of the criteria. So they are only an 88% solution. And we're
Right.
a 100% solution because we cover all of the criteria. Take it from the AB rather than just from us. That is impossible based on the way the requirements work. If you crack open 853 and you read about hybrid controls and different levels of responsibility, they are shared responsibilities. So
Yep.
you got to have one mapped to 171A, and then there should be some form of a RACI matrix kind of overlay, some sort of language in there that talks about where the lines of accountability lay across these different criteria. If you'd like an example, you can find our SRM on our website, and then you can use that and shop around and see which one's good. We put it out there for people to check out, and then you can always get in touch with us if you want some more details. But it's the same age-old wisdom that your grandma told you. If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. We sell people these services. That's how we make money, and we're telling you you can't get it 100% covered. Of course, we would want to tell you it's 100% covered. That's the business, right? But
Yep.
that's just not how it works. It's just not how it works. All righty. Let's see here. Okay. Sandy, you always have really good questions. Thanks for coming by again. Sandy says, on the 23rd of April, Katie appeared at a conference where she was talking about a new DoD initiative to find a fast way to approve contractors' software, with quotes about how she was blowing up the risk management framework, blowing up the ATOs, and how RMF was archaic and stupid. That sounds like Katie. 853 is a large part of RMF and ATOs, and 853 is the basis for 800-171, and CMMC is the assessment of meeting 800-171. So what does blowing up RMF ATO mean to DFARS 7012 and CMMC? The long and short of it is nothing. Nothing will affect 7012 and CMMC, despite the fact that they are closely related. Plan to ask Katie about this next time I get to talk to her, possibly at Seek West if she's able to be there. What Katie is talking about and what most people are talking about when they say, man, we hate the risk management framework and this needs to go away, they hate the bureaucracy that the RMF was placed into, right? There is nothing inherently wrong with the steps of the risk management framework. In fact, if you look at what's going on with this SWIFT software acquisition process, as they're calling it, the DoD is saying we're going to have certain requirements. You're going to have to tell us how you're meeting them. We're going to approve that those things are okay. And then you're going to have to tell us on an ongoing basis that you're still meeting them. Those are the steps of the RMF, right? There is nothing in 837, the RMF special publication, there is nothing in that framework that says it must be a glacial, paperwork, slow, bureaucratic process where authorizing officials take months to issue ATOs. If you control F for automation in 853 Rev 5, it's in there like 800 times, right? There is nothing that keeps this process from going quicker. But people have looked at the bureaucratic system and said, that's RMF, and that's not true. So Katie is right. This process needs to be fixed. Katie is wrong. It's not RMF's fault. You're actually doing RMF just faster with the SWIFT process. But to your question, it doesn't have anything to do with CMMC and 7012 because there's nothing that says that CMMC and 7012 can't be automated over time, that assessments go faster, that verifying hashed evidence can be done faster on the back end. The steps don't mean that they must be slow, but you have to have you're going to have the steps in the first place. So this is the trade-off when it comes to Katie raising attention, is sometimes when we talk about certain ideas, things get lost in the blurriness of the descriptions. DoD watchers have been trying to blow up the RMF for a long time. This is a lot like the security versus compliance debate. People don't like compliance because they don't like the fact that when people meet a checklist, they stop thinking about security.
Yep.
That is not an inherent function of compliance. Because if you had a set of requirements that you thought were the best thing you could get for security, you would exactly want people to comply. They don't like the behaviors around the idea of complying. People don't like the behaviors around RMF. So not a threat to CMMC and 7012. Blowing up the RMF is not a threat to the RMF because they're still going to be doing it, even if we don't want to call it that, if you will. All righty, let's see here. Joseph said, I've always used an MSP, MSSP when we have had lower level resources. It's a great solution. I have met some of my best friends and mentors through working with them.
Very nice.
So there you go. There you go. All righty, let's see here. Will the 7021 clause, so DFARS 7021 will be the contract clause that says meet this level of CMMC certification, whatever, right? So will the 7021 clause allow for both level 1 FCI systems and level 2 CUI systems, rather than just require the high bar of level 2 if both types of systems exist in the environment? This would come down to a scoping question because your actually, let's see.
I think it would be the highest. I think contractually it would require the higher of the two requirements, with the assumption that if there is FCI, you're putting that either in the level 2 boundary or in your other represented boundary through SPRS. But maybe that's just, I can't imagine a contract's going to say, yeah, level 1 and level 2 requirements. And maybe they will, Jacob. I actually don't know. It seems like a very simple answer, but now that you bring it up, I actually don't know if how that would be stated in the contract clause. This is a great question that we will ask at CS2 next week, because we'll have DoD on stage the morning of day 2 for our opening session. This might be one of those things where it's like such an obvious thing that they overlooked it and didn't specify it, and it'll be a humongous problem, or it might be so obvious that they don't anticipate it being a problem. But it's a good question. If you're going to have level 1 systems and level 2 systems, but the contract clause just says meet level 2, then what do you do, right? Because you still have FAR 52-204-21 in your contracts. It says apply these requirements, which CMMC level 1 verifies, but will 7021 specify both? I didn't see who asked this on LinkedIn, but I'll check it afterwards when I can see all the profiles and everything. This is a great question. We will tag this for DoD next week. This is one of those great questions in this space where you read it and you're like, oh, this is the simple answer. And then 10 seconds later, you're like, hold on a second. Ooh, it's like, I don't know about that.
Maybe it's not. Maybe it's not.
I'm going to see if I can find out who that is while we're talking here, Jacob.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a bunch of people in here talking about EMAS and ATO and RMF and all that fun stuff. Yeah, and then Daniel had a good point about the scoping guide, saying that scoping guide says level 2 explicitly states that by implementing level 2, level 1 is implemented within the level 2 scope. But what happens if you have a level 1 system that's not inside that scope? And so, how does that?
An ERP system, for example, or
is it still
something? Yeah.
Now you're still accepting FAR 52-204-21, but you're not necessarily accepting a 7021 clause that says do CMMC level 1. If you only had one system, then it would subsume level 1 by doing level 2. But if you have separate systems, this might be one of those things that we're overthinking, but I don't want to give you the wrong answer. So I'll think about it and look into it on the plane to DC, and then we'll ask DoD next week. All righty, let's see here. Is the phase rollout?
Jerry Peters, I think JARI.
Oh, okay, great. Awesome. Yeah. Perfect. Okay, well, I was looking for an excuse to not have to read the annual DoD Director of Operational Testing and Evaluation 850-page report. So I'll look into that question instead. I've been procrastinating reading that thing since January. You'll hear about it whenever we get done digging through it. The report is interesting because it talks about all the cyber test and evaluation of active DoD weapon systems. And it's usually nightmare fuel to read through it. So it's really, really cheery stuff. Anyways, is the phased rollout still happening? Yes, it is. Yeah. So the phased rollout will start when the DFARS 252-204-7021 contract clause starts to show up in defense contracts. That will happen after the rule that finalizes the contract clause language goes into effect. That will happen sometime between June and October based off of our analysis, because on average, DoD rules that create regulations such as contract clauses, if you overlay the amount of time that they take on average from when the proposed rule came out last year, that would be October. If you overlay the amount of time that the big brother CMMC rule, the 32 CFR rule that went into effect in December, if you take that amount of time and you overlay it, that would be June. So our window of probability here, the cone of probability for the contract storm, I would say is sometime between June and October. Stacy has said she still feels confident that that will be summertime, but it's rulemaking. It's hard to know. It's a very inexact science, so we can tell that it's happening, but we can't tell you exactly when it's happening. We can generally say like what half of the year, what quarter, but by month or by week gets very, very difficult to predict at that point until we have very clear signals. But you'll definitely hear about it if you're subscribed to the YouTube channel, or you follow us on LinkedIn, or you subscribe to the newsletter that Summit 7 sends out. So phased rollout is still happening, hasn't started yet. Voluntary assessments have started though. What are we at? We're 26 clients have their CMMC level. 25. Yeah, we're getting up there. So hopefully at CS2 next week, we'll talk to Matt Travis and we'll get the actual number of how many certified companies are there. You know, what's the rate of growth? Like, what are the projections? What's going on ecosystem wide?
Here's an interesting question I'll throw in here. So Rob Adams posted in chat, serious question, IL4 versus IL5. Have you seen anyone have repercussions for being in the incorrect impact level, and what were they? Yes. I know of 2 organizations over the past year that were in impact level 2, not IL4 and IL5, but impact level 2, which is a GCC environment for Microsoft. And contractually, it required them to be an impact level 4. And they had to basically rush and build out an impact level 4 environment so that they could be awarded the contract. So not at the 4 or 5 level, but at the 2-4 level, I have seen that a couple times.
Gotcha. Thanks, Rob, for stopping by. Oh, here's an interesting question from someone we were talking about earlier this week. Is my HRIS in scope for CMMC? Is my HR information system, things that HR would be dealing with as a contractor, going to be in scope for CMMC assessment?
Typically, no. You're provisioning user identities. There's going to be a level of connection there that you could maybe spin and say SPD, right? Potentially, depending on what it's gathering and pushing. But HRIS systems, unless you're talking about the PII of federal employees, that would spin a different story even outside of CMMC. But long story short, no. You can use like a Workday, for example, to do provisioning of your users into the environment, like Active Directory or Enter ID, all day long.
Nice. Yeah, that was a big relief for the people that we were talking to. They were very worried about that. Okay, let's see here. Someone was asking, can Summit 7 help us with our SPRS score? They've been told they need this score. Maybe they haven't been told exactly what number it needs to be other than perfect, but can we help them with this score?
Yes, we absolutely. We have a team of 5, maybe 6 now CMMC assessors on staff, and I want to say 25 CMMC certified professionals. And that's what they do. They turn the crank on some gap assessments, run by one of my favorite people in the organization, Caleb Leidy. So,
former DIBCAC assessor, the
CS2 speaker historically. I don't know if he's speaking this year, but
excellent beard. Yeah, the grease man behind the show of everything for Summit 7's success here. Okay, another related question. How quickly do we get an SPRS score after we do an implementation project with Summit 7?
That's a good question. So if that's in scope for us to deliver to you, it kind of depends on you, but I mean, it could be as fast as a month or 2. It could go 4 or 5 months, depending on how long it takes you to get the information we need to correctly assess the organization, right? So much of that is internal conversations with people running facilities, right, for physical protections, or your HR team for how they're doing background checks and things like that. The biggest pole in the tent is, can you get everyone to the table that needs to be to the table to produce all the evidence, basically.
Yeah. Man, talk about trying to get everybody to the table. We were talking with a company this week. We had originally talked to them in 2021, and they decided they were
We
going to
call them boomerangs here. And I think I told them, I was like, oh, we get a lot of boomerangs. They're like, yeah, we're one of those. We talked to you in 2021. I'm like, I am so sorry.
We talked to him in 2021. So this would have been right after the 2020 rule, right after Katie was talking and getting in everybody's face, get everybody's attention.
Mm-hmm.
And then all of a sudden they heard, oh, the program's paused. We're going to wait and see what's going on. We're going to monitor what's going on. And now they called us up and they're like, hey, we'd like to get started. And it was very clear right away. They're like, they don't know how many users are involved. They don't know who needs access to what data. They don't know what data is involved. They don't know where the data goes. They didn't have the right people in the call. They don't know when they're going to be able to have a meeting to get everybody together. And then we're getting into summer break. And so people are going to be on PTO. And all of a sudden, we already have a backlog of when we can get them started. And it might be that long before they get a decision made, before they even sign the paperwork. So, it's getting everybody to the table is definitely a long pole in the tent. We tell people all the time, the technology is not the constraining factor on how fast you can go. No. It is the organization that's trying to make this transformation, if you will.
Evan, to your point, better a boomerang than a Frisbee. Yes, you're absolutely right.
Yeah, the boomerangs don't get stuck on the roof as much as the Frisbees do. All right. All right, let's see here. Okay, so we have a backlog. Most of the implementers that we know of in the ecosystem have a backlog currently. If you show up right now and you're like, we need to have our implementation done tomorrow, it ain't going to happen. So people get stuck in this backlog. What should they be working on after they sign the paperwork, but before we get into actual kickoff?
It depends on kind of the combination, if we're doing an enclave or an all-in, but here's kind of a rough list of things. If you're doing an enclave, the name of the authorized users that you want to allow in the environment, that's huge. The applications and the product keys of software you need running in the enclave environment. If you need physical devices part of that enclave, then make sure that they have, TPM chips and Windows 10 or 11, Windows 10 or 11 Enterprise, or Mac OS on the latest version is part of that as well. What are some other really good ones for enclave? Site-to-site VPN connection. If you need connection back on-prem, make sure you have a firewall that can support that, as well as the FIPS 140-2 validated cryptography on that appliance. Those are some of the really big ones. And then the other piece is, like we've talked about before, if there's going to be physical assets, physical protection on your side, badge readers, visitor management, those kind of classic things. And then also from the authorization standpoint, who's approving these people, how are they approving them? What are the means? What's the policy and process that you have behind that? So those are just a few things. And if you're doing migrations, quickly and frequently communicate that there will be a big cutover. We call it a big bang cutover, where, on a Friday night, they're going to exist in commercial. And then by Monday morning, they're going to be in the Gov Cloud. Outlook and SharePoint and Teams, all that will behave the same from that experience, outside of joining Gov Cloud meetings to commercial meetings for those that you have to jump through a web browser. And just know that there will be a little bit of an impact there, especially if you have device joins and things like that. As part of
you're going through an organ transplant. So no food 24 hours before, no water 12 hours before, that whole thing. You got to schedule it on the weekend, let everybody know. It's a big deal.
Big deal.
All righty. So we had this situation come up on a call where people weren't exactly sure the number of users that they needed. But then as we started talking to them, it became very apparent that there were going to be different categories of users based on the type of work they were doing. Thinking engineering firms and people like that with some heavier duty workload requirements. So what is a GPU user? Why does this matter for people planning?
Yeah, so the biggest gotcha here, if you're doing a cloud enclave for virtual desktops cost money. And Azure is a consumption-based cloud provider. So if you need a lot of GPU-enabled systems, H100, I think there's not quite H200 NVIDIA cards in the Gov Cloud yet, but those are in commercial. So if you need like multiple graphics cards with high-spec memory, so forth and so on, your monthly spend can get out of control pretty quickly. So I'll give you an average. So we use an NV6 for personal deployment, and assuming that they're logging in 4 hours a day over 20 working days in a month, because this isn't their full-time, focus, you're looking at around $200 a user a month for GPU versus like a back office user who jumps in occasionally to check email or Adobe or web browsing, whatever it might be. That's closer to like $15 to $25 a user a month, right? So you can see a pretty distinct separation there. And if you want to appropriately estimate what that is, knowing those two types of users is really important, because your Azure spend could go from a few $100 for your user consumption all the way up to thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars if you have a lot of GPU enabled.
Yeah. Yeah. Joseph is like, I was accidentally right on what I thought the answer was going to be.
Love it.
All righty. Let's see here. Hey, somebody called the hotline and left a message.
All right, let's do it.
Hey, team. Here. Thank you so much for the work you're doing on behalf of the CMMC community. You may have answered this before. If you were, I probably wasn't paying attention, but it's when is FIPS validated encryption required under 3.1.17 wireless access protection? I've actually seen the guidance go both ways. I've seen it that you have to encrypt only when your CUI itself that is being transmitted is unencrypted. And I've also seen other guidance that says you should just encrypt it up front. Your opinion is greatly appreciated, guys. And again, thanks as always.
Awesome question.
Really, really good question. So let's pivot to what the control says, and we'll get into it really quickly.
The rule of thumb here being FIPS validated crypto is required when cryptography is being used to protect the confidentiality of CUI. That's the wording in the overall NIST requirements there, is that when you're relying on crypto to protect the confidentiality of the data, the crypto module must be validated.
That's right. So here's where the tension lies. If your wireless controller, your wireless access point, is processing, storing, or transmitting CUI in plain text or in an unencrypted non-FIPS 140-2 cryptography, then it's in scope, and you at least have to have physical protections, if not FIPS validated cryptography on the access point itself. Okay. So you have to have some sort of compensating control so that anyone connecting to that is a compliant device and an authorized user. Same thing on the administrative side. So if you have an MSP that's just doing network support for you and they can intercept that data stream in an unencrypted format, whoa, we got a problem. Again, kind of going back to that. To Jacob's point, FIPS 140-2 is meant for the protection and confidentiality of CUI. So people ask us all the time, Daniel, I work from home. Is my wireless in scope at home? And the answer is no. You don't have enterprise grade controllers sitting on your home, a Fortinet box sitting on my bookshelf behind me, right? It's because the traffic being transmitted through that network is encrypted to the standard already. So you don't need double encryption, right? And what I mean by that is the TLS 1.2 connection to like M365 already is encrypted. Amira does a really good job of this on their YouTube. You don't need double encryption, right? I also don't need the network encrypted if the pipe already is encrypted. But if the pipe's not encrypted to the traffic that you're submitting, either locally or external to your organization, then yes, you probably want to look at FIPS cryptography on your wireless controller itself. So I hate to say it depends, because that's what everybody says, but it depends on how your data flow is set up. And if you're already protecting the data to the confidentiality requirement or not, and how you're doing that.
Yeah, it's the same thing like with network devices, right? Is like if the network device is the one that is doing the encryption, then the module needs to be validated. If the network device is just shuffling encrypted data, then it does not need to have a validated module on it because it was encrypted via a validated module somewhere else.
That's right.
Okay, let's see here. Dustin said, if a SaaS application has a deployment pipeline into a DIB contractor's Azure GCC high tenant, the data stays in the tenant. Does the application need FedRAMP ATO, or does the contractor's CMMC certification suffice?
Ooh, good question. And so I look to the left side of that equation. Is the SaaS application processing, storing, or transmitting CUI into the client's commercial instance, or I'm sorry, GCC High instance, Azure Gov instance? If that's the case, then FedRAMP belongs on the SaaS app. If that's not the case, and the things being provisioned have nothing to do with CUI, then no, that SaaS application does not need FedRAMP.
Yep. It just depends on whether the data is in there or not. Let's see here. Yeah, that's a really good question. All righty. Okay, a couple more engineering type of VM setup questions here. How do we handle updates for AutoCAD and SolidWorks when we're using them in VM environments?
Yep. So you want to update the image fairly frequently, depending on how often things are changing, whether it's just an update or an upgrade to the newest version of Revit, SolidWorks, AutoCAD, whatever it might be. That's one piece of it. But one thing to kind of overlay on this, it's not exactly the question, but I think it's important. People ask me all the time, Daniel, what's the performance like in a VDI environment with SolidWorks and AutoCAD and all of that, right? And I say the VMs themselves are incredibly powerful. And if the data is sitting on the same backbone, aka the data store is also running in Azure, there's going to be very low latency there. The biggest gotcha is if your network connectivity to the Azure environment is above 70 milliseconds of latency, which you can run speed tests to determine what that is, it's going to look like you have the worst performance in the world. So the lower the latency, the better the, quote unquote, seamless interaction with a virtual desktop environment. It will never 100% reproduce running it locally on your physical workstation. It's never 100%. You can probably get it to about 90%, right? So anyways, just make sure that the latency is the biggest thing. And for those users that have high latency, maybe they're in rural Montana or something, and Starlink has high latency for some reason, even though I think it actually has pretty good latency. Maybe you give them a physical workstation connected to the Gov Cloud, so they're running all those applications locally, and then that way they don't have that latency problem. So there's several ways to kind of fix that problem.
But I haven't done this in a while. I actually don't know what the latency is on Starlink. Back in the day, gather round, kids. Back in the day, we used to tie onions to our belts, which was the style at the time. And when you ran a trace route on the command line, if you had something that had 500 milliseconds or more, you knew that your packet was going through a satellite link, which was super fun. Yeah, there wasn't a lot going on back in the day.
Not really.
Anyways, let's see here.
Daniel's got another good one. Is the FedRAMP required for CSP that store, process, transmit CUI, or also if the CSP has ADA, ADP?
Can you spell out ADA and ADP for us, Daniel? That way we don't give you the wrong answer. Let's see. While we wait for that, Orion said, "Look at the headshot for Orion's profile.
That's a powerful thumbnail."
Oh
Orion.
man, oh man.
Don't tread on me.
Does Summit 7 provide MSP services to FedRAMP moderate cloud service providers?
Really good question, and we get that a fair amount. The answer, sadly, is no currently. So my MSP team just took a deep breath that I said no as a salesperson, by the way. So I'm going to get this recorded.
Yeah, I mean, it's a Friday afternoon. That's the perfect thing we could say yes to on a Friday afternoon. And
that's right. That's right.
Give everybody nightmares.
Sadly, we do not, Orion. Maybe one day, and we'll keep you up to date when we do.
Hey, here's a fun one that we can wrap up with. We haven't talked about higher ed in a while. Is fundamental research outside of the definition of CUI and therefore compliance requirements? Yes, if the compliance requirements that you're talking about are the requirements in NIST SP 800-171, DFARS 7012, and things like that. By definition, fundamental research is not controlled unclassified information. Yep. This is covered extensively in the 32 CFR 2002 rule that was published in 2016. So if you Google 32 CFR 2002 2016, you will find the final rule from NARA that outlines the federal CUI program. And at that time, which is, almost That was a long time ago at this point. Most of the public comments and public comment responses circulated around university research, not small business impacts. And they talk very clearly, and they say fundamental research by definition is not CUI. However, in the 32 CFR 170 rule, which is 32 CFR CMMC, so the CUI program lives at section 2002, the CMMC program lives at section 170 of the same title. In 32 CFR 170, there is some language in there that talks about fundamental research that could become CUI magically somehow. I don't know how that's determined, would be in scope for the requirements. Every time I've talked to people at colleges and universities, this makes their heads explode. It makes my head explode. I don't know how that works. I don't know how that will be clarified. I don't know how that will be determined. But apparently the DoD is like, fundamental research is absolutely not CUI, but it could be. And so it's still in scope. That doesn't seem like something that's going to fly with lawyers. But if you are at a university or anything like that, let us know, one, in the chat, if you've seen this issue come up. It should be clear cut that it is not CUI, but there is some concerning language out there in the regulations that make it seem like they gave themselves a foot in the door. And I don't really understand how. I understand why, but I don't really understand how that's going to work. So it's something to pay attention to if that's relevant to your situation.
Can we get back to Daniel's real quick before we jump
off?
Oh,
yeah. Okay, so he says, I meant SPA, SPD. So we'll wrap up with this one here. Is FedRAMP required for cloud service providers that store, process, transmit CUI, or also if the cloud service provider has SPA, SPD? So
it's a little bit of a blended answer. So if it has CUI, process, store, transmit, it's got to be FedRAMP moderate or FedRAMP moderate equivalent. If ITAR is a component of that, also check the U.S. persons and sovereignty of where that data is sitting. For security protection assets, if it's not processing CUI as part of that process, transmit, process, store, CUI. So like think a spam filter. It's going to process and transmit CUI because it's taking the ingestion of that CUI, validating that there's no malware on it and moving it forward. So those have to be FedRAMP if it has a CUI component to the action that it's doing as an SPA. But if it's an SPA that doesn't have anything to do, like Intune's never going to process CUI, right? At least in the Gov Cloud, because things like remote assist don't work yet. Then that would not have to be FedRAMPed. So if it is truly CUI, FedRAMP all the way. If it's an SPA that's processing, storing, or transmitting CUI, FedRAMP all the way. If it's an SPA that's doing nothing with CUI, but just supporting in a security function, no FedRAMP needed.
All righty. Well, if you guys have some questions that are like specific to DoD policy, if you'd really like to poke and prod at the DoD over things that you've heard or things that you think, then make sure that you put them in the queue for CS2 Reston next week. We're going to have a hotline live. DoD may or may not be there, and we can yell at them in the audience. They'll be there on day 2. And so you'll be able to submit questions. And so, yeah, CS2 Reston is next week. We do this every Friday, but be on the lookout next week for the hotline to be at a special time and place. If you catch my drift, CS2 Reston is next week. Wink, wink for those of you who have stayed to the end of the stream. So you can find us on CUIHotline.org. We got a number that you can call and leave a message. Thanks to everybody who's done that. We got a form where you can leave questions. Many of you have been leaving very good, very lengthy questions via the form, which we appreciate. We will queue those up for next week, which is CS2 Reston. Did I say that yet?
Yep, just a few times. I took about 6 shots in the last 60 seconds here.
There we go. Yeah, producer Dustin's like, more. So
we just work for him. We work for producer Dustin.
He's really the one who's pulling the strings back there. So, alrighty, that's the stream. We do it for an hour every week. I got all these banners queued up, and they're popping up at the last second here. We'll see you at CS2 Reston. Still time to register virtually, and if not, we'll see you on the stream after that. And we'll catch you then.
See y'all.